Every time when I pray over the stories of Scripture, trying to discern the best way to lead us all in our new series, the story of Ruth hits me up again, trying to find a way to let me preach it, I guess, every 4 weeks. In our series for the next 3 weeks, we're going to be trying to figure out what it means to be a steadfast Christian. And here is where Ruth found me and would not let me go. Because Ruth, if you've read her story, or even if you have not, is the most steadfast person in Scripture. Even more than any of the patriarchs before her, more than Abraham, more than Isaac, more than Jacob ever was, Ruth is. Which is incredibly strange if you consider that she's female, in a book and a culture that privileges the voices and stories of men more than women. She's not an Israelite, in a book that privileges the stories of Israelites over foreigners. She's poor, she's an immigrant, she's all the things that you wouldn't assume the hero of a story in the Bible would be. And yet, she has a whole book named after her. Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, though. If you don't know, Our Lady Ruth and her story take place in what's called the time of the Judges. That means it's way past the days of Moses and Joshua, and it's into the days of Gideon and Samson and Deborah. And we're right on the cusp of the stories of the kings, because, spoiler alert, Ruth is the great-grandmother of David. But it's still in the dark days of the Judges, when the Israelites go through cycles, terrible, terrible cycles of turning away from God and then begging for salvation and being faithful for a little while before they forget again. Each successive judge is worse and worse of a person. Samson is such a bad person, the only way he can redeem his people is by dying. Their violence grows, their apostasy grows, their evil grows more and more powerful, and over the stories it becomes altogether too evident that ruling themselves is not something they're really good at. And into that walks Ruth and her mother-in-law. The book of Ruth largely is concerned, of course, with Ruth, but it is also the story of Naomi, as everything Ruth will do is connected to her. And in fact, without Naomi, we don't know Ruth at all. The beginning of the story is a sad one. There used to be more to this family than just these two women. Naomi had a husband and 2 sons, and they were all a big happy family in Moab until... That's always how it goes, isn't it? In the hero's story, everything goes well, and then Orpah and Ruth were Moabites, not Israelites, married to expatriate Israelites, and famine kills all of the men. That's not good news in a patriarchal culture which does not allow women to have rights or own property. These 3 women would have had to band together to try to survive the desolation of being a widow in ancient Palestine, and it was more likely than not that they would die in the process. Naomi does a very generous thing. She releases her daughters. She releases her former daughter-in-laws to go home to their mothers, because apparently, even though they've been married for a decade, they're still young enough and maybe pretty enough to get married again, which is their only salvation in this culture. But as she extends this grace to them, she reveals the hurt in her own soul. She has become bitter, even though her name means sweetness. She blames God for her troubles, Naomi does, and she also worries about what she's done to bring God's wrath in this way. Naomi, once sweet, now bitter, just tells the women to go home, and Orpah pushes back a little bit, but then she disappears off the pages of our text, presumably back into the arms of her family. and we do not denigrate that choice. Ruth, however, Ruth, our brave and steadfast Ruth, refuses to go home. Naomi pleads and reasons with her, I can't give you sons to marry. Even if I got pregnant this day, would you really wait for a child of mine? The text here, though, is so compelling that you have probably heard it read in straight marriage ceremonies, even though it is words spoken between two women and a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law. It's worth repeating in its entirety. Naomi tells Ruth to go, and Ruth says, do not press me to leave you. Do not press me to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you live, I will live. Your people are my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and that is where I will be buried. In Hebrew, Ruth's statement of steadfast commitment is even more emphatic than the English lends itself to. There are no shalls, there are no wills. Directly translated, it is you live, I live. Your people, my people. Your God, my God. You die, I die. We don't know why Ruth is so committed to Naomi. We don't know their history, whether or not they were really great friends. We don't know what Ruth's husband was like, whether or not their marriage was happy or not. All we know is that Ruth has agreed to leave behind the country of her birth, the chance to ever see her family again, to journey into enemy territory, into Bethlehem of Judea with her mother-in-law, where they will possibly die of poverty together. How strongly do you feel about your mother-in-law? Whatever we don't know, this is the place where we meet Ruth. And all we know of her is this: she is brave beyond reason and steadfast beyond breath. Seemingly, their years of living together has taught Naomi not to push Ruth when she makes grand statements like this, and so they go home. And past the scripture where I ended, they get to Bethlehem in Judea, and Naomi is so bitter, she says, you should just call me Mara, because I'm no longer sweet. Mara means bitterness. And in her bitterness, she doesn't even introduce her daughter-in-law to the townswomen. It may be that Naomi was hoping to go home to die without her foreigner daughter-in-law tagging along to remind her of everything she had lost. But even with an auspicious non-introduction, Ruth is still the most important person Naomi will ever know. Because everything that happens at this point in the story is centered around the redemption of Naomi's life. Ruth will work and rest and eventually meet Boaz on a threshing floor and then marry him later. And Naomi's emptiness and bitterness will be turned into fullness and life. Ruth is the redeemer of Naomi, which is a fitting role for the ultimate grandmother of Jesus. Well, this is all nice, of course. It's story time. Who's Ruth? But the question begs to be asked, what does Ruth have to do with any of us? I'm not Moabite. My husband's not dead. I'm not going to wander into Bethlehem of Judea. Why should a story about a loyal widow and her mother-in-law really matter to us? I think it's because it is so difficult to actually be steadfast, to be unwaveringly loyal, to be staunchly true, not just to God, but to each other. Here's an uncomfortable truth. I love you. We have lots of things in common, and some of you have political beliefs that make me puff up like an angry cat when I think about them. I'd imagine some of you feel the same way about some of my political leanings. We're generally on the same page when it comes to the direction and purpose of the church and Christian life, but sometimes when we talk about it, I'm not sure we're talking about the same thing. Again, some of you probably feel the same about me. And I'll tell you that whenever our differences start to crop up, the lizard part of my brain shrieks for me to just run away and find other people who will agree with me more. To find a tribe more closely aligned and to abandon the difficult work of being a community together despite difference. Maybe you felt like this before. I hope so. I hope I'm not confessing something terrible on video. Sometimes the differences between us can be so wide, they feel like untraversable caverns that we don't even really want to try to go over. But then I read Ruth, and I feel bad. Remember, Ruth, not an Israelite. She's a Moabite. And the Israelites don't have a good relationship with Moab. Early in the book of Genesis, we read a legend of how Lot's daughters seduce him. Ew. It's like Game of Thrones in Genesis, if you've ever read it before. Lot's daughters seduce their father, and they have his kids. Ew. It's okay to say ew in the Bible, guys. That's gross. And the sons they bear him are Amnon of the Ammonites and Moab of the Moabites. Both people groups that end up being the ancestral enemies of Israel. If you're going to say a bad thing, you say it about Moab. So Ruth is a Moabite. Incest. Gross. She's a Moabite, but even more simply, she's a foreigner. And though it used to be okay, in Israel's history, there came to be these rules. Rules about who you can marry and who you couldn't, and you definitely couldn't marry foreigners. And by the time of the exile and the return, the xenophobia, which is really just a fancy word for you don't like people who are like you, who are not like you. The xenophobia is super strong. The story of Ruth was actually probably written down and kept in our scriptures to combat a growing sense of racial purity and racist hatred towards each other. Why? Well, it's really hard to hate the foreigner and the stranger if the stranger looks and acts like Ruth. It's even harder to legislate racist laws against foreign people if you remember that the great-grandma of King David was a Moabite. Ruth, the Moabite, has nothing in common with her mother-in-law except for a dead history. She has nothing in common with the people of Israel except a really gross, far-back relative. Ruth was not even a follower of Yahweh. Naomi tells her daughter-in-laws, go back and worship your own gods. But the differences don't dissuade Ruth from standing by Naomi, from being committed to a future together with her. So do I, really have any reason not to stand with you, with our neighbors out there during good times or bad? Now, I will say being steadfast does not mean we ignore each other. Sins and injustice, it doesn't mean we excuse evil. We never do that, guys. What we do is stay committed to each other despite the fact that we must be corrected and must correct each other. That we are committed to a beautiful and difficult practice of actually staying with each other as we struggle to figure out what it even means to belong to God. It means we stop dredging up old history to rehearse over and over again, and we start figuring out how to live together now. It means we put aside grudges and ego, and I don't like doing that because my grudges are really fond to me. We put them aside, and we put selfishness aside, and we decide to forge a future together. It means we stop letting everything different between us, and man, there's so much different between you and me. We stop letting that be an easy out of transforming relationships. Being the church together means choosing steadfastness, like Ruth chose for Naomi. We serve God together. We serve our church together. We serve our city together. In this political season, this unending political season that is divisive and racist and angry and polarizing, Ruth stands shining like a beacon, repudiating all of our bad behavior. She is a hated Moabite who commits her life to an Israelite. She leaves behind what would be best for her and commits to a way that is best for Naomi and her. She is the definition of steadfast, which of course makes sense. Her legacy is the way that Christ lived. He loved Jew and Gentile. He touched the unclean and hung out with the outcast. He expanded the horizon of God's grace to the whole world. He stood steadfastly on the side of humanity, even when humanity killed him for it. So what do? We stop talking and acting and Facebooking and voting in a way that is merely about me and starts to be about my neighbors. We stop thinking about what's best for my sphere right here, and we start thinking about what's going to be the best for all of us together. We stop letting differences divide us and instead commit to loving and serving and making each other better, no matter how hard that is. And it's really hard, guys. It's really hard. We remember that past September 11th was September 12th, when the incredibly rich and the terribly poor came together and served first responders as they began a tragic and fruitless search for survivors. They stood by each other, and the story is told that at food lines, if you looked down at the ground, you would see Louboutin high heels next to bare feet. They stood by each other, they fed each other, they wept together, they hoped together, they sheltered one another, despite the fact that there were a million reasons why they would never even know each other. We look now to the congressmen and women. Yes, there are some good politicians. We look to civilians. We even look to these celebrities who, more than 15 years later, now make it their goal to advocate for those first responders who, in the years since, have gotten ill and died because of the service they gave. They have stood by them and made sure that they have health care and support, no matter what it costs them in reputation or how different they are from one another. We let them, we let Ruth, we let her great-grandson Jesus show us the best way forward, and the best way forward is alongside each other. As a church, as the Heights, as Houston, as Texas, as America, as the people of Earth, we stand by each other. And we work for each other's redemption. And we never, ever let go. Pray with me.